Recent reports show that immigrant women are 3 to 6 times more likely to experience domestic violence than U.S.-born women. According to the immigrant rights organization We Belong Together, they are often left vulnerable to an abusive partner for reasons having to do with how our visa laws affect these women's ability to find employment. We'll hear about that in a moment.
And since October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we want to take this opportunity to ask our next guest about this very serious problem and where we are in terms of policy, programs, and services. Let's welcome Carmen Maria Rey, the Deputy Director of Sanctuary for Families, Immigration Intervention Project. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So it's DV Awareness Month, October, right? Can you tell us a little bit of how that issue changes when you add immigration onto the plate?
So we all know that domestic violence is not just a relationship where individuals hit each other. Right? Domestic violence is really a relationship that is governed by a power and control dynamic where one partner has power and exercises control to maintain that power. And so unfortunately, the way that our immigration system works, where the person who has immigration status has all the power to give immigration status, to pass on immigration status to the immigrant, that helps to kind of cement that power and control dynamic when the person with immigration status is the person who's the abuser in the relationship. And so, realistically, in immigrant communities, there are really two types of immigrant communities. Those where the immigrant in domestic violence, the immigrant is in a relationship with an abusive partner who has immigration status and uses that immigration status as that tool to maintain power and control. And then immigrant communities where we have two immigrant partners who one is the abuser but still does not have immigration status and the other one is the victim and also lacks immigration status. And in those relationships, it's often the partner who is abusive often just has access or some knowledge about the community that the other partner lacks.
So to that access point, there is a certain sense of isolation that definitely enables abuse to continue when it's very insular from the home or in the community. So what are some of the things that we as a broader society and with government intervention can do to break down that isolation and empower survivors of this abuse?
So it's interesting. One of the things that we see is empowering immigrants to come forward and feel like they're part of the community, to not have to fear deportation, is something that empowers them to come forward, report the crimes against them, and help get themselves into a better place in their lives. And we're very lucky to live in a city like New York, where not only are there a multitude of organizations like Sanctuary for Families working to empower immigrants who are surviving domestic violence and human trafficking and other types of gender-based violence, but there's also an incredible amount of support from the city itself. Everyone from the mayor's office to combat domestic violence through the NYPD is aware of the issue and tries to make sure that immigrants feel supported and not have to be afraid of involvement from federal immigration authorities. Immigrants in other spaces aren't as lucky. And also, unfortunately, because of that very isolation, the information about New York City being a safe space for immigrants doesn't always trickle down into the communities themselves. So one thing that we can do, I think, is to definitely support the work of organizations, nonprofits that are working to empower communities, to immigrant communities and survivors of domestic violence, but also to support legislation that continues to allow immigrants to feel like they're part of the communities that they, where they live and where they work. That is very, very important in order for immigrants to feel safe enough as part of their communities to come forward.
You mentioned legislation. Obama recently took executive action that helped immigrant women in several ways. What was that, and is it working?
So the Obama administrative action was incredible in the message that it sent. And it really has trickled down to the way that we see the Department of Homeland Security act towards immigrants.
Just shy of a year to contextualize it. We're about 10 or 11 months out of his executive order.
Yeah, so there are a number of different actions that he addressed during that announcement. The ones that had kind of the most direct impact are actually tied up in legislation in Texas, and we still don't have decision. So two of the actions that I think had immigrant communities in New York so excited were, one, the extension of the Deferred Action Program for juveniles who had been brought in when they were children and kind of were blameless in their violation of immigration law. And that extension would have allowed now adults who were brought in as children to request the right to remain in the United States lawfully. That is stopped up in legislation in Texas. And then the second portion was the ability for parents of U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents who themselves don't have immigration status to request a temporary right to remain.
As long as they've been here since 2010.
Since January 1st, 2010, and have a child who is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident born before November 20th of 2014. That is also stopped in legislation. Yeah. So we have seen no action about around those two programs. So the excitement in immigrant communities that really rose in November of last year has been somewhat dampened because we really don't know how the court is going to rule. That said, there was a great push by the government to kind of make the effect of immigration laws more fair. And we really have seen through programs like prosecutorial discretion, which have had immigration authorities kind of release immigrants from detention in certain circumstances, decide to terminate cases against individuals that really have no reason to be deported.
When they take a comprehensive view of the whole thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Instead of just exercising the law without regard as to individual circumstances. And that has had great impact. What we were seeing before, especially in cases of domestic violence victims, we knew, because we're experts, and we go out and we talk to these women in detention facilities and around the city, we knew that our clients really shouldn't be deported. But because of the very isolation that they were experiencing in their lives prior to encountering immigration, we couldn't prove the cases. And so we were seeing situations where
there was no documentation, there's not the friends or the camera phone pictures or police reports.
Exactly. And so clients were really afraid that they were going to end up being deported from the country and separated from their children. And that has tremendously improved.
So we know we've come a long way in this country with intimate partner violence to even get to the point where we can acknowledge it with a month in October. But it's been a really hard-won battle to bring this out of the shadows. And a lot of that has to do with popular culture and popular media exposing these things and making it not such a taboo thing to talk about. Is that a trend that's continuing to other populations where they can look to something, even if they're isolated? I know you sort of get the movies from where you're from and have a very tight, insular community, but has that trickle down happened in the popular culture?
Absolutely. It's actually quite interesting because as an immigration attorney, my population of clients is from all over the world, and it's really amazing to see how cultures have developed their understanding of domestic violence, so that often my clients from Latin America, for example, completely understand what domestic violence is. They may understand it as a culturally acceptable form of violence, but they understand it as a concept. Whereas, for example, clients from certain parts of the former Soviet Republic, the former USSR, maybe don't understand it as a cultural concept. It's quite interesting to see that. When we think about it, Sanctuary for Families has been around for 30 years fighting domestic violence, and we were one of the first legal centers dedicated solely to representing without cost survivors of domestic violence. And we started in a time when it was kind of par for the course that New York police officers would respond to a domestic violence report, and they would walk the offender around the block, calm him down, bring him back in the house where he would continue to reoffend.
It's none of our business.
None of our business. We over the last 30 years, that has done a 180. And what's really interesting is that we are actually now do a tremendous amount of work around human trafficking. And even in the last 12 years that I've been at the agency, it is incredible the way the United States has kind of understood the concept of human trafficking and really created laws, created funding to support anti-human trafficking work, and now understands, for example, that human trafficking and domestic violence often go hand in hand in particular communities. We're doing a lot of work around forced marriage now, which is a huge issue in the United States, of forced marriage of young girls in particular from certain communities. We've done a tremendous amount of work recognizing that female genital mutilation is a huge issue that isn't spoken about around gender violence. work around recognizing that domestic violence in same-sex relationships in the transgender community often looks different, but needs to be responded to in a similar manner.
So Carmen, as we look at this in an election year when the buzzword is comprehensive immigration reform and we don't really have a lot of concrete definitions of what candidates think that is, do you think that this is a portal into really moving the needle on immigration, if we can relate this to abuse and really saving a family and transforming lives where, it's not just them, like everyone can relate to being hurt? Is this a sort of that we might be able to change things?
We try, and I think a lot of the work that we do is legislative work at a state, at a city, state, and national level. And I think for many years, one of the strategies that we have used to bring to light the issue of immigrants and the way that immigrants are affected by these laws is to put our clients at the forefront and say, our clients' children. DACA, for example, children brought here kind of against their will, but they're here in violation of the law. Can we please take into consideration their individual circumstances? We bring forward domestic violence survivors, and we say these individuals should not be harmed by the laws. Recognize them as the individuals that they are and the circumstances that they face. Realistically, given the animus against immigration that we're seeing, we continue to try to bring these issues forward, but we have gotten a lot of pushback. If you think about even the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which is the law that really served to transform immigration law to create legal remedies for survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, that faced a ton of pushback in the Senate when we were pushing for reauthorization just a year and a half ago. So even when that gets so much pushback,
a hard road.
Right.
It's daunting, man. It's a lot.
Really just unbelievable. I mean, the statistics are just staggering. Let me ask you, while we still have you, only a quarter of all employment visas are given to women as principal holders. I mean, going back to that first type of relationship that you mentioned where the abuser has the visa and the victim or the survivor does not. Where do those numbers come from? Why? I mean, what's the reason for only giving the spouse the visa and not the woman in particular?
So what we have to think about when we're talking about statistics like this is kind of the larger scheme of immigration law. So when we're thinking about employment visas actually make up a minuscule amount of the lawful status that is offered by the United States government. The majority of individuals that get immigration status in the United States do it through family-based petitions. The classic green card marriage that we all hear about. Employment visas are actually
They're all snapped up by Bill Gates and his
right.
friends.
I mean, when you think about who is paying for lobbyists and immigration reform, it's firms like Microsoft and Facebook that can't bring in they can't have native-born engineers. We just don't have enough. So they're trying to bring in foreign engineers to work at their firms and other STEM field candidates.
And they take them all up.
And they take the employment visas, right? We actually, as a country, give very few employment visas. Some would argue many fewer than we actually need. When we're thinking about family-based, though, we're talking about mostly about 70% of the population. That's where you have to have one individual who has that status in order to petition for you, and they can remove the support of your petition at any time. So you're tied to them forever. When you think about it, we have delays in our visa issuing process. There's such a backlog. For certain people, it can take up to 30 years to be able to get that visa.
Be independent of that person who petitioned. Well, we are going to have to leave it there. Like 30 years later. It takes 30 years. There's no way we could tackle it in 15 minutes. But Carmen Ray, thank you so much
Thank
for
you
the
so
work
much
that
for
you're
having
doing,
me.
joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.